As I was preparing for this morning, what I came up with feels more like a lecture than a sermon. Sometimes I'm not entirely sure what the difference is, but this one definitely sort of feels more on the lecture, sort of informative kind of thing. But it comes out of both of the main passages this morning. That the passage that was just read, wisdom stands out on the street corner and proclaims. And if you can imagine, I'm guessing most of you have a difficulty imagining yourself doing this. That for the most part, we're a pretty introverted bunch. And standing on the street corner and proclaiming is really not what we can feel comfortable doing. But you can certainly imagine if you found yourself doing that you would get some response. And you'd have to deal with response. And so part of what I'm trying to get at today is how we deal with response when we're trying to say something in our current world. And Jesus, right, and his disciples encountered the same thing. And Jesus said to the disciples, well, who do people say that I am? Which means that he's assuming they've been listening. Right? They've been talking, and they've been noticing people respond to Jesus, and Jesus has been like really out there, right? Jesus is not one of these hide in the back corner sorts of dudes. That he's been out there, and people have been responding to him, and sort of the Gospels are full of Jesus says something, and the Pharisees say something back, and Jesus says something, and the crowd say something back. And so there's lots of back and forth. And I'm assuming at this point, especially at this point in our nation's history, that you get involved in those conversations, right? That the world around you requires response. And there's stuff happening. Doesn't matter like which side or whose side or whatever side. There's stuff happening in the world that this just isn't the way it should be. Right? And yet there's other people, maybe co-workers, maybe friends, maybe family members, who say, yeah, this is exactly what we want. Right? And so these conversations happen. And when these conversations happen, so much of the time, in my experience, people talk past one another. Person says something and somebody else says something else, and there's just no actual communication going on here. And so what I want to talk about this morning is just doing something to think about increasing the chances of actual communication happening. So the stuff in your bulletin, A through F, comes from research done by a man named Roger Haidt, who is a sociologist who works in the area of morality. Something sort of ironic about someone named Haidt working on morality, right? But anyway, and he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And he did a whole bunch of research on what are the moral foundations of people. Right? And he sort of boiled it down to 6. And you can think about these as foundations if you like. I tend to think of them as just as language games, as ways of talking about things, but they're sort of bigger than just language. They're about sort of whole ways of thinking about the world. And so he said, well, these are the 6 basic categories for the way that people think about moral issues, about what is right and wrong, and these things are just, these things just come up, right? So the question Jesus asked is, well, who do people say that I am? And I think today the question almost more is, like, what does the church really stand for? Right? In the mess that the world is in, where's the church in this? And so as we talk about this, as we have this conversation, here's what happens. The first thing is that people talk about is care. We need to care for one another. Right? So the foundational care for all of us is the care that parents have for their children. Kids who grow up without being cared for have a hard time with life. Somebody needs to care for their kids, right? And so we continue that. We sort of expand our circles of care to include others, and then how far that goes is a question, right? So we think about relieving suffering, providing basic safety for people, nurturing, protecting, right? Just all this sort of basic care language as one of the ways that people talk about things that are right and wrong. So, right? What's the right thing to do? Well, you got to care for people first. So that's the first thing we do, right? So that's care. Number B there is fairness. So there's an internal drive inside of human beings to take care of ourselves first. Right? The famous book that came out a while back is called The Selfish Gene. There's this internal drive. But we are also willing to trade some of our energy to help others if there's some sort of trade going on, and if this trade is fair, that if I'll do this for you if you do something back for me, if I get some sort of reward. For many of us, that's like a paycheck, right? We're willing to take care of other people's children, or take care of other people's diseases, or all of these things, as long as there's some sort of fairness involved in this trade, whatever it is. So fairness is a basic foundation. We want to do things that are fair. So we talk about people who deserve it, or the reciprocity of it, or the cooperation. All of these things are part of fairness language. Now what Dr. Haidt discovered in his research is that for people who identify themselves as liberals, that's basically their whole moral universe. Those are their two really big ones. And they might go down into C, D, E, and F occasionally, but basically people who identify with liberals think about care and fairness as really two foundations of their moral universe. But people who think of themselves as conservatives also understand care and fairness, but think about the moral universe also in terms of C, D, E, and F. So they've got 6 foundations to their moral universe. And so what happens regularly is that a conservative will make an authority claim, and the liberal will respond with a care response. And so they're not communicating. And in order to have a real conversation, either the liberal has to explain to the conservative that authority doesn't matter, which is about equivalent of saying breathing doesn't matter, right? Just not going to happen. Or the liberal can learn to speak authority language and make their own claim based on authority. And then a conversation can happen. Well, that's the trick in making this conversation happen, or part of the trick in making this conversation happen in our modern world. Now, fortunately, for those of us in church, even if we think about ourselves as liberals, right, we can fairly easily talk those other 4 languages, because they're also part of what we do here. And we don't necessarily do them the same way as others, right? Which is why there are liberal churches and conservative churches, because people just talk different languages, right? But there's still something built into this system about these other languages, and so it should be easier for a liberal Christian to talk to a conservative Christian than it is for a liberal, secular person to talk to a conservative. Okay. So let's go over these just to make sure we understand what's going on. Loyalty. Right? Loyalty is all about loyalty to a smaller group. It's very difficult to be loyal to the whole human race or to all of creation. Right? That's just that ends up being really nothing at all. What we tend to be as human beings is loyal to our tribe. Right? We're loyal to ourselves, we're loyal to our families, we're loyal to our tribes. Beyond tribes gets really tricky. Right? And again, we tend not, as Americans, to think about America as tribal until it's football season. And then we're really tribal. And then we understand loyalty to our tribe, right? So this afternoon, the Chiefs are playing Pittsburgh, right? The Steelers. And I've been a Chiefs fan for 20 years now.
This is football, by the way.
Yeah.
People are very close.
And it's hard, right? Like to think about, like, should I become a Steelers fan? Because I've been a Chiefs fan. Yeah. See? Right? So, right? Now, this gets into more important things, but that's sort of the one that's really obvious to everybody, loyalty to tribes, right? And we used to be loyal to all sorts of things, like people, who were part of the Church of the Brethren went to a Church of the Brethren, and people who were Lutheran went to a Lutheran church, and we had that sort of loyalty, which seems to be disappearing in our modern world. But we were loyal to organizations and institutions, and certainly nationally, very big words. Right? And so we think about those things. We think about team and allegiance and sacrifice. right? And certainly betrayal and treason are horrible, horrible things. Right? So this is the sort of language that is, again, more typical for conservatives, less typical for liberals. But here we are. And the reality is that most of you come here almost every Sunday, which suggests a certain amount of loyalty, that you can speak loyalty language, right? And when I read from the Bible, you go like, what's this book about? No, there's a certain amount of loyalty to this book, right? And to one another. So, right, so shouldn't be that strange for us. We should be able to talk that sort of language. And the same is true of authority, although authority is really tricky. I'm guessing for some of you, authority is a really tricky thing. Pastors deal with this all the time. What is my authority here? The authority to be disagreed with? Sort of what it feels like quite a bit of the time, right? The authority to try to herd cats, right? Or like the book, right? What's the authority of this book? Yeah, you recognize that I'm probably going to read from it, and I'm going to say things from it, but does it have any authority for you? I don't know how you would answer that question. But just the fact that we are here and, I get this job and we've got this book suggests that authority is a language you can speak. That when somebody says, well, but people in authority say this, well, you understand that. We get that. We can have a conversation about authority. Sanctity. We should be good at sanctity. But even sanctity is tricky, I'm guessing, for many of us. Right? Is this building holy? Am I holy? I don't feel very holy. Right? What is, and yet, right? And yet we come here and it's not like the rest of the week. Right? And sanctity basically means not like the rest of the week. That's basically what sanctity means, something set apart. And so we, hopefully as people of faith, we have some sort of connection to the sacred. There is something out there that is bigger, that is more important, that is just not like everything else. And so when we hear the sacredness of this, or this is sacred and that is sacred, we've got a book here that says, no, really only God is sacred. And all this other stuff that we make up all the time about being sacred, no, it's not. Sanctity. And finally, liberty. Right? And this, of course, is really foundational American language. Freedom. Try to imagine a speech by any president in our history who doesn't use the word freedom in a speech. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's your least favorite president or your most favorite president. The chance of them getting through a speech without using the word freedom is pretty close to zero. So this is really foundational language. And what's interesting about it is that it conflicts, of course, with authority and loyalty language. Right? Are we free to disagree with authorities? That's where it gets tricky. But is also very, very foundational scriptural language. Right? Let my people go. Freedom. Right? Big stories. Right? All over, right? Christ has come to set you free from the bondage of the law and things like that. So all of these are ways that we can talk to people that we disagree with. Right? And when the tricky part in all of this, I think, is to actually listen. Right? So that when somebody is saying something you disagree with, can you listen well enough to hear their language? So that when they're talking about all of this is really important. Not necessarily these results, right? But these conversations we have. And thinking about, so what is sacred? And what sort of authority do you believe in? And how do you exercise the authority you're given? And in some ways, this is what we do. We try to figure out every week as we go through our week. The authority of our positions and the loyalty we have to various things. So that's the challenge for the rest of our lives. To continue to have these conversations, to actually listen well enough so that a conversation can begin, and then to participate as best we can in ways that are more than just care and fairness, but are about other things as well. Amen. Our